The Netflix Cleopatra documentary is one of the most blatant and shameless attempts at manipulating history to forward a political agenda that I've ever seen. Something its director is in fact proud to admit, even though it's meant to be a docuseries. Last I checked, documentaries are generally supposed to be truthful. And since this channel is mostly about ancient Egypt, here's my own little rant about the whole situation, and I've tried to add in a bit more historical information than the other videos, just so that we don't waste our time here. First of all, just because Cleopatra was born in North Africa doesn't mean she was black. Even if you consider the ancient Egyptians to be black, which I don't think they were, since ancient Egyptians looked like modern Egyptians, who'd have thought, Cleopatra wasn't even Egyptian. She belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was established by one of Alexander the Great's generals, a Macedonian man named Ptolemy. After Alexander died, Ptolemy seized control of Egypt, ruling it in the name of Alexander's relatives until 305 BC, when he declared himself pharaoh. Ptolemy's descendants went on to rule Egypt for almost 300 years, and during that time they engaged in so much incest that they put the Habsburgs to shame. For example, Cleopatra's great-grandfather, Ptolemy VIII, married both his own sister and her daughter, his niece, who also happened to be the daughter of his older brother, Ptolemy VI. Here's Ptolemy VIII with his two brides, both mother and daughter. You probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that these guys were always at war with each other. And to make matters even more confusing, they're pretty much all either named Ptolemy or Cleopatra. The famous Cleopatra was Cleopatra number 7, and it's a miracle that she didn't turn out like that. So it's safe to say that they didn't really intermarry into the local native Egyptian nobility, especially since all the Greeks that settled in Egypt along with the Ptolemies made the Egyptians an underclass in their own country. Only native Egyptians with any power were the priests, which the Ptolemies kept happy by lowering their taxes, which is what the Rosetta Stone is for, and building and adding on to tons of different temples, including many of the most famous and best preserved ones. So yeah, that's right. In making Cleopatra black and what they deem Egyptian, the people behind this are actually snubbing the very important fact that she wasn't, and that in today's world, they'd accuse her of being a colonizer. Granted, she was the only one of the Ptolemies to ever bother learning how to speak Egyptian. Some people have claimed that Cleopatra's mother was a black concubine because it isn't known for sure who she was, but she was almost certainly her father's sister or cousin, Cleopatra V Tryphena, who's also confusingly known as Cleopatra VI. She may have helped their daughter Berenice IV revolt against him and likely died in 57 BC, when he was in exile. Her paternal grandmother is even more mysterious, and her father Ptolemy XII was viewed as a bastard, so she could have been an unknown concubine of totally unknown ethnicity. She also could have just been Cleopatra number 4, and Ptolemy XII might have been viewed as a bastard just because she was never co-ruler with her husband Ptolemy IX, as was Ptolemaic tradition. In fact, if anything, Cleopatra probably had a bit of Persian in her, due to her connections with the Seleucids, a Greek dynasty which ruled Persia and did intermarry with some of its nobility. We also have plenty of contemporary depictions of Cleopatra that prove for sure that she wasn't black. There are many idealized Egyptian-style depictions of her in the guise of a traditional Egyptian queen wearing ancient pharaonic regalia and dress, but there are also more naturalistic Greco-Roman depictions of her. I think her coins are the most accurate because they're the least flattering, depicting her with strong masculine features and a big hooked schnoz like her husband Mark Antony shown alongside her, and her royal ancestors. In fact, he might have been made to look a bit more like her and her family. So, contrary to popular belief, she wasn't exactly the most attractive lady in the world, but clearly she gave Julius Caesar and Mark Antony a pretty good time. There are plenty of other busts, statues, paintings, and cameos of her, like this bust of Cleopatra in the Altes Museum in Berlin, and this one in the Vatican, which bear the same features shown on her coins, except a bit softer and more idealized. They both come from villas which once lined the Via Appia going south of Rome. A restructured, life-size statue of her was found along the Via Cassia going north of Rome, and it's also held in the Vatican. This bust in the Archaeological Museum of Churchill in Algeria might also belong to her, but it could also belong to her daughter, who later went on to become queen of the area. It also turns out that plenty of possible paintings of her were preserved in the towns destroyed by Vesuvius. This 1st century BC painting in the house of Marcus Fabius Rufus, the largest domestic dwelling in Pompeii, has been identified as Cleopatra in the guise of Venus, with her son Caesarion as the little Cupid on her shoulder. It's been identified as her because it shares some features of hers, wears a crown, and because Caesar erected a gilded bronze statue of her in the Temple of Venus Genetrix at Rome. She's also famous for depicting herself as Isis, Venus's Egyptian forebear. Later on, the painting was also mysteriously walled off, possibly for political reasons. Two painted profile busts from Pompeii and Herculaneum, respectively, dating to the mid-1st century AD, have also been identified as Cleopatra because they also bear her distinct features and her diadem. They would still be posthumous portraits of her since they were made in the century after her death, but if they really are her, then Cleopatra probably had red hair, also indicated by the painting of her as Venus. The Berlin Cleopatra also had red grounds in its hair, and it sort of looks like it's stained purple, eh? Just as an aside about her more traditionally Egyptian look, that doesn't mean she was a native Egyptian or that she always dressed like an Egyptian, which this documentary seems to think. The Persians, Alexander the Great, and even the far-off Roman emperors who hardly ever even visited Egypt were depicted like traditional pharaohs, wearing traditional Egyptian regalia and adoring Egyptian gods. Cleopatra probably most often wore Greek clothes and wore her hair in a bun, encircled by a diadem, like how she's consistently depicted on her coins and statues. She probably only dressed in traditional Egyptian regalia during certain rituals, and she definitely didn't have hair or even wigs this frizzy. Also, the documentary makers really show how much they don't care about the history they're supposedly trying to portray by having Cleopatra wear an unusual crown with 2 Uraeus cobras on it, when wearing 3 of them was Cleopatra's actual signature look. Like, come on. It's just one little cobra. Also, what the hell are these? But most importantly, the way these people treat history is something that can just be changed because they'd like certain historical figures to have the same skin color as them is insane. That should go without saying. Just look at this guy.
I imagine her to have curly hair like me and a similar skin color.
I mean, he's not that far off, but the sentiment that history should be what makes me feel good is totally off. The old lady who says that Cleopatra was black just because her grandma told her so really takes the cake. It blows the revealed to me in a dream footnote right out of the water.
I remember my grandmother saying to me, I don't care what they tell you in school, Cleopatra was black.
Her name is Shelley P. Haley, and somehow she's an actual professor of classics at Hamilton College in New York. The fact that this kind of uneducated, feelings-based nonsense serves to narrate the documentary goes to show how low this show's standards really were. But the most revealing quotes from the people behind the documentary come from an exclusive interview Variety had with the series' director, Tina Sharavi. First, she just straight up admits that she made Cleopatra black to further her political agenda, even though she was supposedly trying to make a documentary. Then, and this really takes the cake, an Egyptian guy named Amir contacted her from Cairo and told her that Cleopatra wasn't black, she was Greek, and her response was literally, "Why would that be a good thing to you, Amir? You're Egyptian." By saying that, she reveals that she thinks your perception of history shouldn't be based on the truth. No, it should be based on what's convenient for you, what you feel history should have been like. Oh, and she also thinks she gets to downtalk people and decide what their opinion should be about their own history. Imagine the arrogance, it's insane. Immediately above that, she also promotes the myth that the Arabs completely displaced the original ancient Egyptian population, which is just ridiculous. She also asks why people need her to be white, which she sort of was if you consider Macedonian Greeks white, but of course the real question is, why do you, Tina Gravi, need her to be black? Like, what issue do you have? Many Egyptians are also pretty pissed off about Hollywood distorting their history. By insisting that Cleopatra was a native Egyptian and then casting her as black, the documentary is effectively saying that the ancient Egyptians as a whole were black. The Egyptians understandably don't like their history being toyed with like this. An Egyptian lawyer is pushing for Netflix to be blocked in Egypt now, and an Egyptian-made Cleopatra documentary promising to properly cast Cleopatra has been announced. And of course, Egypt's notorious former Minister of Antiquities, Zahi Hawass, just had to pipe in, but what he's saying is definitely true. Hollywood is falsifying real history, and it has to come to an end. Now, I know this is going to be a controversial opinion, but at the end of the day, Cleopatra is sort of overrated anyways. Yeah, she was certainly intelligent, cunning, presented herself magnificently, and had an insane amount of influence over her world. But she lost, and largely due to her excessive ambition. She lost her kingdom, her lover, her own life, and brought about the end of her 300-year-old dynasty just because she somehow thought trying to divide up the whole eastern half of the Roman world between her infant children with Mark Antony was a good idea. I'm referring to the so-called Donations of Alexandria of 34 BC, which was one of the main reasons why Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, was able to declare war on Antony and Cleopatra. Antony had already gifted her huge chunks of Roman territory in 36 BC, and after the Donations of Alexandria, she'd style herself as Queen of Kings, like on this coin. Antony and Cleopatra were decisively defeated at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC, with a big reason for that being Cleopatra and her ships deciding to flee mid-battle, which disheartened Antony and made him abandon the battle too, literally jumping into the water so he could get to her. The people brought in to narrate the documentary downplay this and argue that somehow it was actually for the best since they were already losing, but I don't buy it. And that's why Mark Antony and Cleopatra eventually had to kill themselves the next year when Octavian landed in Egypt, making it a Roman province, which it would remain as for over 600 years. It was the end of Egypt being ruled independently by pharaohs, but it wasn't even really the end of the pharaohs. Roman emperors up until the early 4th century AD had pharaonic titles and were depicted on the walls of the temples they built in Egypt as any other pharaoh was, which I mentioned earlier. Most importantly though, this was not the end of native Egyptian rule over Egypt, as heavily suggested by this documentary. No, that happened over 300 years before Cleopatra's time, when Pharaoh Nectanebo II was driven into exile by the Persians. Native Egyptians wouldn't lead Egypt again until the 1950s with Nasser. This just goes to show that the people behind this documentary don't give a single shit about real history or even showing real colonialism if it means hurting their narrative. And Cleopatra did some terrible things to secure the throne she eventually lost, namely killing all of her young brothers and sisters, with the exception of her oldest sister, who was instead murdered by their father. What a happy family. She was also at the head of an especially oppressive command economy where farmers just couldn't leave their villages at certain times of the year, and famously she also tested out poisons on criminals just to figure out which one would be the least painful for her to use, which definitely doesn't sound like something a tyrant would do. Cleopatra definitely loved her children though. One of her last acts was to relinquish all of her enormous personal wealth to Octavian in exchange for their lives. He still murdered Caesarion, of course, since he saw him as a threat, but her other children, with Mark Antony, were sent to Rome and given a good upbringing by Octavian's own sister and Antony's ex-wife, Octavia. Cleopatra's only daughter, Cleopatra Selene II, even became queen of another North African kingdom, Mauritania. Just because I think she's a bit overrated doesn't mean that I think her story isn't fascinating and compelling. No wonder it's ingrained her into the public imagination and inspired countless works of art over the centuries. But this documentary definitely isn't one of them, though. Anyways, I just had to talk about it because of how much of a middle finger it is to real Egyptian history, and I just go off about how Cleopatra's a bit overrated. Goodbye.